this is Collaborative Check-ins, and my name is Dr. Lori Baudino, and today I'm here with Lisa Klein, a speech and language pathologist. And Lisa, thanks for coming and talking with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored to be here.
So not only do I refer so many families to you to learn about how important the body, the mouth is in language and speech in terms of our emotions and our mood, but I have to share that like my own children even went there. I learned so much from being in your office and things that I even use on myself. So I'm hoping that parents listening and providers listening can realize what a great adjunct to what we're doing is and how critical this is to our children. So maybe we start off with talking about what kind of kids you work with. How would someone know, hey, I need to go and visit this office?
So we see a variety of ages. We start with babies if they are having difficulty latching, babies if they've had a recent tongue or lip tie and they had them released. And then we go, we see all ages up through adults, depending upon what is going on with the client. When we're looking at specifically OMD or orofacial myofunctional disorder, we are looking at how the tongue and the mouth, what they're doing, at rest, what they're doing when they're eating, what they're doing when they're speaking. And it's really critical, and it's a critical area that many people are not aware of or what to look for.
Absolutely. And it's so often, I think it's changing over the past maybe 5 years. I've heard it start to change, but there was this idea of like, oh, your baby doesn't latch and that's just some babies do, some babies don't. Mm-hmm. Or, oh, they're having trouble sleeping or they're colicky or they're fussy. And it was just kind of like, that's what babies are. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's so empowering for myself as a parent, as a provider, and for parents to hear that there's actually things we can do about it. Absolutely. And then it actually impacts their development, their hand-eye coordination, their communication with kids in school, their sleep, which affects everything. So tell us about this mouth of ours. We come in, and it's so little, and babies are supposed to sleep with breathe through their noses, but now we know kids are not doing that as much as they used to be, or
early on, and very early on. And I think what happens is when we're first born, okay, we are born nasal breathers because that allows us to actually latch and suck, swallow, breathe through our nose without having to constantly come off the breath and take a big, breath of air. And so from like immediately once they are born, this is what we want to see. And like you said, oftentimes, even starting with newborns, we are seeing a lot of children that are mouth breathing, and it can really be harmful for them in many ways, in the way that their face and their mouth develop, in the ways that their jaws develop, and how they're sleeping. And again, not to go into too much anatomy, but just really quickly, from birth to 2 is a really crucial point in time for these children, because this is when they really develop their skills that they're going to use for eating and drinking that they use throughout their entire lives. And people don't realize that, and they come in at 5 or 6 or 7 and their kids are still on soft foods. And that also impacts how their mouths are developing.
Right. And I hear often when I get a child and there's like a behavior, so they might be coming in and saying like emotionally, or they're like non-compliant, like they're fussy, they're difficult, they won't eat these foods, right? So that's like one example. Or very picky, or there's like a big upset around mealtime, and then you look a little bit and you're thinking, oh, that child's tongue is thrusting out, or their mouth breathing with their mouth open, or they're using a lot of work in that jaw just to bite. And I just see it even visually now that I've learned, a little bit from you, and I've been reading my books and things like that. But it becomes this thing where we think it's about this behavior, but really the child's been having this mouth that's really difficult to use. It's like, I imagine like having a fork that doesn't have the end parts to it and trying to eat with it. It's like hard to work it. And they have this tool that they can't use.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And so what we want to see, our rest posture, our natural rest posture, is our tongue up to the palate and our lips closed. Nasal breathing all the time, of course, unless we have a cold. But even then, we want to clear our cold with some saline spray and make sure that our nasal cavity is as clear as it can possibly be, as often as it can possibly be. And when we start to see these kiddos that have this low rest posture of the tongue and these open mouth, they're not able to use the tongue. go into feeding. When we feed, we put food in our mouth, we take the food, we put it to the side, we chew, 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 we then put it to the other side, chew, 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 squeeze it in and swallow. These kids do not have the ability to move their tongue for feeding. And so what you were saying is we see these issues around mealtime and these kids that are quote unquote picky, but what really came first is it that their tongues couldn't do what they needed to do to manipulate the food, and so they avoid because it's overwhelming for them? Yeah, or is that they're truly picky, you know? And so that's one part of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I was thinking about right now during COVID, and just to kind of jump forward, but I'm thinking about COVID, and we've got kids at home and they're on a screen, they're in class, and to me, even in therapy sessions, I see children and their tongues will counterbalance whatever they're going through. Their tongues or their mouth will start to droop. And I'm just curious about hearing a little bit about that, because this might be a time where parents start to notice their child's face and what's happening, or like really underbites or overbites, or, you know, really unclear words when they're speaking, because now they're, you know, spending more time with your child. You're like hearing them talk when they respond to a teacher. You're hearing them like respond to the teacher's question. Parents might start to notice, like, wait a minute, I didn't realize they speak like that. Or I didn't realize the mouth looks like that.
Right. And that is true. And what happens is light pressure moves bone. So if our tongue is constantly resting down and we're open, okay, we're also not allowing the jaw to move forward, okay, down, forward, because we have this constant light pressure of the tongue sitting on the jaw, right? And we see a lot of kiddos that are in that rest position. And the other part of that, not only is it the jaw, but the tongue is supposed to fill the palate. So the palate, right, the tongue is supposed to sit up there. If there's nothing holding the palate goes up. And that's when we're seeing these kiddos with nice, high, vaulted, arched palates. But then to throw something else on top of that, the palate is the base of the nasal cavity. So if the palate is nice and high, it impacts that nasal breathing, which is what we want to see all the time. So everything is connected. And so getting that tongue up and getting those lips closed is imperative.
Right, right. And then this goes into the nervous system, which I talk so often in every interview I'm doing. It's like comes back to like, if our body's in fight, flight, or freeze, if we are in stress mode, talk about now pandemic, talk about now new changes with being online, missing friends, all those extra things. But there's this underlying stress where the body is working a lot harder to either, like you're saying, hold the jaw up, or just breathing through the mouth, which is sending a message to the body. Is that correct? It's sending a message to the body that it's like not getting the right amount of oxygen, or it's stressed?
It's not getting the right amount of oxygen. The nose also allows to clear the allergens in the environment, which there are many. And so we're not clearing the allergies out there. We are not getting oxygen into the brain. We're not getting into this deep sleep, which, going back to what you're saying, this fight or flight, if we're not getting deep, restorative, oxygenated, hormonal growth sleep in stage 3 or 4, because the way the tongue and the mouth are working, we're seeing these kids either having difficulty sitting and having, attention, or we're seeing really tired children, children that are waking up feeling tired all the time because they're actually not getting into that deep sleep.
It's so important. And just, again, it just backs up that idea of like, there's underlying reasons of these behaviors that come up, of like, the child's not lazy, they're not bad, they're not being difficult. But if you're, I think I've mentioned to you in passing of just like when I'm working with a child and we're doing play, or we're sharing an emotional story and we're engaging together, and the child's breathing as if we're running a marathon, I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of work to just sit, and you're just doing like a puzzle. And imagine you're in school all day and you're breathing like that, and your body's getting this message that you're in this heightened state of arousal, when really your body can relax and your brain could just be working and getting the information going on. So
and it's that CO2 exchange. When we're hyperventilating like that, it's really unhealthy, and then it does impact their school. And especially right now when they're sitting on these computers all day long, right? And they're slouching over, posture, holding their necks out. We have to really be on top of where their tongues are in space, where their lips are, how much oxygen they're getting in, and, really, take a look.
Yeah. So when a child comes to your office, there's so many different activities and their games, and they're quite fun, and they're, you know, one-on-one. And then there's some exercises to do at home.
Mm-hmm.
Is there general ideas that parents could be doing with their kids, or is it very specific depending on the child?
You know, there are some exercises that do overlap from child to child, but not every child needs every exercise. So it really depends on what's going on. And so if a child, we measure lip strength. So if a child's lips are weak, we give the parents exercises to do to strengthen the lips to get them closed, right? Because if their lips are hanging open, they're not using them. And so they kind of lose them, you know, for all intents and purposes. But so there are some overlap in exercises, absolutely, but we do tailor each session for the child, and we take measurements of the palate, and we see how wide or how narrow. We see if they have range of motion for the tongue, you know, and if so, how much. Can they even get their tongue to rest up? And if they can't, is it because they have a restriction? And so, you know, we do look at a lot of areas, and so there is some individualizing each client session.
Yeah. And then we're talking about this overall health with the tongue and the face posturing. And then there's this other part, which is about language and speech, like communication, articulation. And some of the kids I imagine, and I know of, that I've sent over to you, that just in terms of like how to pronounce a word, how to be very clear and concise. And I'd love to hear and kind of talk about it a little. For me, on the psychological side, how meaningful it is for a child who has so much to share, and yet their words aren't being fully understood. How you know, life-changing that can be, to feel like, wow, I didn't, you know, I felt like I was empowered to like speak because I could say what I really wanted to.
Absolutely. And you see these kids when they come in and they work hard, you see how proud they become. You know, they get really excited, and that allows them to want to continue, even though sometimes it is challenging for them. You know, it's not easy because the mouth is a muscle. And so if you're not using it, you have to all of a sudden become aware of what to do with your mouth and where it needs to be. And, you know, sometimes kids come in with articulation difficulties due to this low rest posture of the tongue or a lingual tie. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes their speech sounds are fine. So that's another thing that we do look at is, are they able to say these sounds, especially the sounds that require them to really tighten their tongues or get their tongues up to the palate, like SHs and Rs and CHs and Js. You know, we see a lot of difficulty with those sounds.
Before we say goodbye, what's some information that parents can just be mindful of as we continue to do this online learning and this social distancing, and also just throughout our child's development with their language and speech?
So some, you know, again, depending upon age, but some of the red flags for myofunctional disorders is take a look at your kid's mouth at rest, you know, and are they really breathing through the nose, or are they slightly open and breathing through the mouth? How are they really sleeping? So a lot of times parents will come in and say, but they sleep 15 hours, but they move around all the time, or they, you know, wake up to go to the restroom. These are really important things to really consider. You know, are your kids picky eaters? Do they avoid certain foods? And do they have difficulties saying certain sounds? And those are some of the red flags that while we're home, you know, sitting at home with our children, that we can really start to think about. And if some of these red flags are jumping up, you might want to find a myofunctional therapist that can help work with your child.
And I imagine, because I've seen your sessions, this is something that we can do virtually.
Absolutely.
And you all are currently open and providing services. So it's, I thank you so much for sharing this. And I'm just excited for people just to have, all this is about that mindset of just being aware of like these options for our children. And it doesn't mean it has to be forever, but once you have those tools, we really can support each of our children. And like we've mentioned, just really helping the entire body, so they can be accessing their education and socializing and feeling really amazing throughout every day.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me.
Is there a website that we can link to or look at?
Sure. My website is LKSandassociates.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.